Hello, everyone, and thank you so much for joining us today for Science Division Live. My name is Talia. I'm part of the Virtual Experiences team at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, and joining me today is Dr. Gabriela Chavarria, who is our Chief Curator at the Denver Museum of Nature and Science, also known as our Vice President of our Science Division, and an expert on native bees. Now, this week is Pollinator Week, and we're going to get to hear from Gabby all about what that means, about some of the species that we're celebrating this week, and why honeybees, who we often think of when we think of pollinators, aren't the ones that really deserve the crown this week. So Gabby, go ahead and turn your camera on if you can, give everybody a wave. We're so excited to get to hear from you, and I'll turn it over to Gabby in just a moment, but for now, what everybody at home needs to know, or wherever you're watching today, maybe you're on a lovely stroll through the park on your lunch break, maybe you're back to work in the office and you're watching at your desk, wherever you are, we want to hear from you today. So go ahead and leave us a comment on the stream today. Let us know where you're watching from today. If there's anything that you're excited to learn about, pollinators that you regularly see in your yard, we would love to know that about you. And of course, throughout the time that we're connected today, leave us comments with questions that you have for Gabby, and we will answer those at the end of the show. I will be watching the entire time on my handy dandy device, and I can't wait to hear from all of you. So without any further ado, I'm going to hand it over to you. Tell us what the big deal is with Pollinator Week and what we're celebrating.
Great. Thank you, Talia. It's wonderful to see you. And it's wonderful to be here with you all today. I'm starting to share my couple of slides that I wanted to share with you because, as Talia said, this week is Pollinator Week. And on Pollinator Week, we celebrate all pollinators. It happens every year and it's been happening for the last 20 years. And it's a week that we recognize, all of those little creatures, the unknown heroes of nature that, that bring the high diversity of plants that we have in the planet. And those pollinators, all of these heroes that you will see here, you will see this picture and you think about it, you have the evening and then you have the day. And you can see the diversity of pollinators in the evening and the diversity of pollinators in the day. So all of them, are the ones that are bringing diversity of plant, of flora around the world. Many of them are very important because they pollinate a lot of the foods we eat and the fruits we consume. And a lot of them just, they pollinate unique plants and flowers. So they have a really close association with, specific plants that they only pollinate. And, I wanted to share with you today, we're going to be talking about native bees, about bees in general. And bees are, probably you don't know because Talia was saying at the beginning, you usually think about honeybees as, the main pollinators. But we actually have about 20,000 species of bees in the whole world. And they go in size for this little tiny perdita, which is about 0.08 inches, to this large carpenter bee that lives in Southeast Asia, that is about 1.54 inches. So that's the diversity. In between, you have all this array of different bees. And I will show you some specific to Colorado. But a lot of these bees are solitary in behavior. They live alone. They might live, in a communal, but, each one of them have a little hole, except for honeybees. And, and honeybees live in a hive, and like you probably all know, and they produce honey and they pollinate a lot of, plants, agricultural crops. But honeybees are not native to the United States. They were brought in from Europe to pollinate the agricultural crops that we still have and that they need the specific pollinator. And in this case, the crops came from Europe, so we needed the European pollinator. So that's how the honeybee came to this country. And you all know honeybees are social, so they live, in hives. But native bees, we have about 940 different species of native bees here in Colorado. And you can see the big diversity of, faces. I always say I'm a taxonomist, so, I need to see the faces of the bees to tell you the different species. But these, the colors, the hairs, the faces are so different, and they give you all of the different diversity that we have, with these incredible pollinators. And as I was saying, here in Colorado, Next time you're in your garden, take a look, get close to the flowers and see if you have some of these bees. Most of the native bees do not sting like honeybees do. They don't have a functional stinger, so you can get close enough to see how they're collecting the pollen from the flowers. So we have here some Halictides. They're coming, all sorts of metallic colors. We have here some Agapostemons that are just these beautiful little bees that, metallic and, combinations. This one in the center is one of the famous mason bees that, they're orchard bees. So they're very, very common and popular in a lot of our orchards. And we have Melecta over here, and then which is, a parasitic bee. And then we have over here Melisodes, which is, also a bee that is very common here in our gardens. And a lot of these bees, they're solitary, but they like living in these, condominium likes. And each of the bees will live in one of these holes because they like to have, their own little apartment, but they do like to have neighbors. So there's, now people build, this incredible diversity because depending on the size of the bee, it will be the size of the hole. And these condominiums have been very popular and they're very common. You can make your own, or you can purchase online, or, in any of your garden stores, you will find them. And you can put them in your garden if you're growing a lot of the native plants, because your plants will need these native pollinators in order to feed. And sometimes a lot of these native bees also like to nest on the ground. So, as you plant, leave them some space on the soil. They will make these little holes, and they are, they're very clever, and they will come in and, find those areas. So that way, you're giving them also a habitat. And, and they're giving you a free service because they're pollinating your native plants. Also, a native species in Colorado is the bumblebees. And I think most of us are familiar with bumblebees. And we have about 22, 23 species here in Colorado of bumblebees. And they start their life solitary, but then, they build small nests, and they usually live underground. And some of these species, are rare, but some of them are also very common. So in your garden, you probably already saw Bombus hunti, which is a very, very common bumblebee, which has this orange. So when you see these two orange stripes, you will know that you have Bombus hunti. Or Bombus morrisoni, the orange and black is a bright yellow with black, and you will see it is very common down here in the Denver metropolitan area. So, and bumblebees, they're solitary, they're very, very wonderful if you have tomatoes. Hopefully your tomatoes are being pollinated by bumblebees because they are the perfect pollinators for tomatoes. A lot of these plants develop specific attractions, and they're designed to attract very specific pollinators. So that's why it's so important to protect our native bees if we want to have native plants, because non-native species just tend to rob some of the pollen and nectar that, from these native species. And bumblebees also could be nest. They can nest in these artificial homes, very different than, the other condominiums I showed you earlier. But, they like to live in the dark, so these will have a cover, but you can also place them in your garden. The only thing that I want you to remember is bumblebees sting. So if you have children or you're, allergic to bee stings, I wouldn't recommend one of these nests in your home. And even though bumblebees are totally harmless, and, their original name was humblebees, because they hover and they're just beautiful little bees. They're of course my favorite. And but these are really great condominiums you can have in your house. So you can help us during, this pollinator week and beyond by, learning more about, native bees here in Colorado. Colorado State University Extension has this really great program on Native Bee Watch. So you can join and you can learn more about the work that they're doing. But it will also teach you a lot of these native species that, you live with because they're in your garden. And then I wanted to share with you a really great news that I recently happened here in Colorado. A panel of judges, requested, ideas to create a Colorado pollinator plate. And they came with this incredible idea, this beautiful color plate. I love it. And then, of course, I'm even totally biased because there is a bumblebee. Bumble's hunti made it to the plate in Colorado. So there's a lot of ways that you can help these creatures. And so plant natives, create little habitats, and, and spread the word about pollinators. So I think I'm ready to answer any questions if you guys have any questions.
There are some questions that people have asked us, but before we do those, I just want to say a huge thank you for sharing. I think pollinators are really great to talk about because they are species that people see all the time. Whether it's you live in an apartment and you just happen to have a tomato plant out on your balcony, or you have a big backyard that you can fill with all kinds of plants, or maybe you're just someone who likes to take walks around your neighborhood. I think pollinators are a kind of nearby nature that all of us can be familiar with and all of us should really learn more about. So thanks for taking the time to share. And I think we've already got some people who are resonating with your presentation today. Also, I want one of those license plates. I think I'm going to have to do it. Yeah, they're too cool to pass up. First up, we have a question from Nancy, who's wondering about how native pollinators interact with non-native species of plants. I'm going to call you out for a second because that was just such an important point, is that pollinators and plants that reproduce via pollination by animals kind of evolved together, right? So a lot of the time plants have a specific shape or colors or scents or other things that are designed to attract or deliver the maximum amount of pollen to the bodies of the animals that they kind of evolved alongside. So how does that relationship work? Can you tell us a little bit more about that, maybe in bees, but also in other species, and what we see as far as non-native plants? Do our native pollinators still interact with those? That's a big question, I know.
Yeah, well, and our native pollinators really are very specific to our native plants. And because they're solitary, they don't produce a lot of brood. There's usually probably they will produce 2 or 3 or maybe 4 new bees every year. It's not like, the honeybees that will produce thousands of, honeybee workers every year. And, and the special relationship that these native pollinators have with the native plants is because the plant wants to ensure their reproduction. So they really need to have that special pollinator. And when you have a lot of these non-native species, and, the honeybee is very clever, and, and it will go into the plants, into the native plants, just to rob the pollen and the nectar without doing the reproduction that the plant needs, because the honeybee is not the native pollinator. The flower didn't design itself to attract honeybees, but to attract, the native species. Yeah. And in a lot of the challenges that we have in our landscape, particularly in the West, with a lot of the non-invasive plants, it has been because a lot of the pollinators, honeybees mainly, or sometimes bumblebees, because bumblebees will eat any pollen or nectar. They spread the pollen and the nectar, and and they spread these non-invasive species, these invasive species into the landscape. So they continue to grow. And that happens everywhere because, a lot of these invasive species start reproducing faster, and they start to encroach a lot of the native habitats. So at the end of the day, just think about this, Talia. If you're left in an island where there's only broccoli and you happen to do not like broccoli, you eventually will have to eat broccoli because that's the only plant there left. And that's what's happening with, some of these ecosystems with invasive species, with invasive plants. They take over, and then eventually, some of the pollinators, will adapt to start eating that. but there will be others that are so specific that will disappear, and the plant also will disappear.
Yeah, that's the really important point here, is that it's like two puzzle pieces that have to fit together exactly. And like when you're doing a puzzle, sometimes you think two pieces fit together really well, but they don't quite go together perfectly and it's kind of forcing it. Yeah, there's a really specific match a lot of the time between plant species and pollinator species. And then, yeah, those invasive species can push out those specific matches. And then we see two species disappear, the plant and the pollinator. Thanks for that answer to that tough question. I see a question from Mina here, who is wondering how bee species and insects in general, or specimens, not species, excuse me, are preserved in the museum. What can you tell us about what we're doing at the museum to study insects, bees, others of all kinds?
Oh, and I wish, our curator of, insects were with us today. He's probably watching because he has been training some of our teen science scholars on, collecting and pinning some of these, some of the insects that will eventually go into our collection. So, and, collections are very important because they give us the history, the historical life of, a lot of species, how they were, 100 years ago, 50 years ago, last year, and this year. So that's what we do a lot in our collections. Our curator of insects, Dr. Frank Krell, specializes on dung beetles, but he is very well known, for knowing everything on entomology. Our collection managers too, Jeff Stevenson is also a wealth of information on insects. So, but we go and we collect, and in fact, this summer is the first time that the museum is starting to collect some insects in City Park. Mm. And so we are starting to build a collection of insects that are found in City Park. And Jeff and Frank and their two teen science spent an evening a week ago in the park collecting in the evening some of the evening creatures. So they get, they trap them with a net. In this case, they had a big white sheet just with a light to attract the insects. So they collected them and then they put them in, these famous killing jars that we all had when we were children. And then we bring them into the collection and then we pin them and we add a label with the data of, when we collected them. And then eventually we learn more. We either, the expertise in-house gives them a name and the species, and then we save them into special drawers in our collection to study for the future.
Yep, combination of pinning, alcohol, but the label is the really important part, because without that data, that collection means nothing.
Nothing.
Great question, Mina. Thanks for asking that one. We've got one from Nancy again about other species of pollinators, specifically asking about pollinating bats. Nancy wonders if we have any of those here in Colorado, and if not, maybe where could we find them? I'm curious.
Yeah, we don't have any of those here, Nancy. The majority of the bat pollinators, you find them in the desert in the southwest of the United States. A lot of them pollinate a lot of the saguaro cactuses and other cactus species. And they're just beautiful, beautiful bats. One of my favorite, and you will love it, Nancy, is the Leptoseros Mexicanus, which is the bat that pollinates the tequila plant. And this bat migrates from northern Arizona all the way down into central Mexico. So, and they're, pollinating all of the agave plants, the cactus plants, as they move, through the country and through Mexico. So they're just beautiful, and they're just beautiful bats. They have these long, long tongues, and and so that way they can suck the nectar that the agave produces. And meanwhile, the bat gets all over in their hairs. They get pollen, which again gets transported into other plants. And then, in Australia, we have a lot of, pollinator bats in Southeast Asia. But in the Americas, most of the bats we have are, they feed on fruits and seeds.
So the next time you enjoy a margarita, it's summer, which means it's margarita season for all of you who are watching who are over 21 years of age. The next time you have that margarita, make sure you thank a pollinator, because they are the reason why you have that agave, why you have that tequila. I always think that's kind of cool, a neat little natural connection there. And yeah, bats have kind of a good fit with their flowers that they pollinate as well. You know, one thing, if you look at the flowers of plants that are pollinated by different animal species, you see different shapes. Flowers that are pollinated by bees are different than the ones that are pollinated by bats, which tend to be sort of cup shaped, different than the ones by hummingbirds too. Hopefully everybody can get outside. It's supposed to be nice and cool this weekend, not blazing hot temperatures like last week. So get outside, take a walk, and see what pollinators you can spot. Our final question of the day, and this one is kind of a hypothetical, so forgive me if we get a little bit silly here. Mina's got another question for us. They are wondering if we took spiders to the International Space Station. There at least used to be a very cool exhibition within the museum about that, as part of our Space Odyssey exhibit. Now, of course, Space Odyssey Reimagined is open with brand new stuff, so if you haven't been, come check it out. It's very cool. Mina's wondering, what would happen if we took a colony of honeybees or put some bees up on the ISS? It's a little silly, it's a little hypothetical, but you know what? That's science, right? Is we have
That's
to ask.
science, exactly. Yeah. And that's, that's beautiful. And, that reminds me a sad story about, the pollinators going to space, because a decade ago, when, the big shuttle that didn't make it back exploded, it actually had taken into space a couple of colonies of carpenter bees.
Oh, I don't think I knew that.
So they took bees because there was an experiment that some children's school was doing. So, but we were never able to capture that. But it would be, if I were in the space station, Mina, I wouldn't like to be there with honeybees. I would love to be there with any other, native species, because I can only imagine in that tight space that unless you have the bees enclosed in their hive, they couldn't be flying everywhere. And, I don't know if they will be able to fly either. That's a good question. But let's say that they're just like crawling around the whole space station. That would not be something that I would like to do.
No, that doesn't sound so fun, does it?
Any native species, yes, absolutely.
That's a good question. And then, that just gets us back to some of the differences, right? Between the honeybees that we do often associate with stingers and that will sting you if you mess with them, versus those native bees that are a little bit more relaxed and chilled out. And side note, I had never known that bumblebee came from humblebee. And that, I think, is the cutest science fact I've ever learned in my entire life. They are really chill. They sometimes will bump into you while they're flying around, and they just kind of, I'm sorry. Yeah. And then they keep going on their flight. Oh, that's amazing. Every time I get to talk to you, Gabby, I come away with such a greater respect for pollinators, and I'm already a nerd about animals and bugs and insects and plants and all of those things I personally already really like. And talking with you, I always just feel that love and that excitement for that kind of nature deepen. So thank you so much for spending some time today talking to me and talking, of course, to everybody who's watching at home. Before we say goodbye, I'm curious if there are any ways that you are personally observing Pollinator Week, or something that anyone who's curious about learning more should do to sort of observe this week in celebration of our pollinators.
Ivy, I love this week because I get to be invited to many panels across the country and share, my love for bees. And this time that I live in Colorado, I can share, the diversity that we have here. But there's been, a great week because there's a lot of activities. And if you just Google Pollinator Week 2021, you'll see all of the activities, from films, to their fact sheets that offer you plants that you should plant wherever you are located geographically. Because remember, we don't want to plant something that is not native. And just learning more from, experts working on these species. So there's a whole array of different activities, and even our national parks, our national wildlife refuges, they all are celebrating this week and inviting people to come and learn more about these species.
Sounds like there is a wealth of information, a wealth of resources out there. All you got to do is go out and find whichever one works best for you. Perfect. Well, with that, everybody, I think we are just about ready to say goodbye. Thank you so much for tuning in to watch us for Science Division Live. We so appreciate these weekly opportunities to connect with our audience wherever you are. Again, whether that's at home, you're on your lunch break, you're hanging out and working at your desk and need something to listen to, we are so happy to get to be that resource for you. So thanks so much for tuning in, and we'll see you next week. In the meantime, stay healthy and stay curious. We'll see you later. Bye, everybody.
Thank you.